Hello, everybody, and welcome to Adamize. I'm here with Jelani Cobb, a contributor to The New Yorker and a professor of African American Studies at UConn. And we are here today to talk about the fiscal cliff. No, I'm just kidding. We're actually here to talk about Django Unchained, which Jelani wrote a great piece about for The New Yorker. We both have actually very different feelings about the film, but I thought Jelani's piece was really good. And why don't you just sort of summarize it for people so we sort of know where you're coming from?
Well, I'll start by saying that I was really looking forward to Django Unchained. I was one of those people that knew about the film and had been waiting for it to come out for months and months. And then when I saw it, I found it to be kind of not quite what I was expecting. And, it's kind of freighted territory, anyway, to talk about slavery in any context, much less to do it in movies. So there's a lot that can, get lost in translation. I felt like the movie failed in some ways. I know a lot of people really love the fact that it's this revenge epic and there's a love angle to it and so on. But I thought that it was attempting to be subversive in certain ways by, flipping the genre on its head and having a black person who's defending, the virtue of a black woman, as opposed to, the idea of, the hero always being white and the love interest always being white. I thought those things were really interesting. But at the same time, my main concerns were I thought that it kind of reiterated some of the same issues that it was seeking to critique. One, even for a movie that's set in slavery, just the use of the N-word, I thought was excessive. And at some point, it seemed almost gleeful, like reading, I can't read anything into what Tarantino was thinking, but listening to it, it just seems like it was raised to the level of a pronoun at some point. And so when you just could have said he or she, it seemed like they used that word instead. And were it not for his previous track record, in films like, Jackie Brown and Pulp Fiction, where the word was used with some frequency, I might have been able to give him a pass on this. But in this case, I think I was saying in the piece, it seemed to me like racial ventriloquism, where, it's radioactive for a white person to use that term in America, but if you put it in the mouths of black actors, you get to use it by proxy. There's also very...
So if we could talk about that for a second, I think that's really interesting because I feel like this is the first time this is one of the few times where I actually didn't feel like that was going on, right? Like I feel like in the past Tarantino has used the word nigger very provocatively for the purpose solely of provocation. I mean, just sort of because it's a word that people have a lot of feelings about, and he just thinks it's rebellious to use it. Whereas in this movie, it's almost exclusively used. Well, not exclusively. It's not used. In one of its other sort of modern contexts or iterations. It mostly comes from the mouths of racist white people. So, like for the first time, I felt like watching a Tarantino film in which he is like peppered this word throughout the script. He is not using black actors to use the word in order to piss people off. It's actually being used in a context that's, at least vaguely appropriate.
Yeah,
where it's like there's no like racial alibi, right? Because it's not Pam Grier and Samuel L. Jackson using it. It's like it's Leonardo DiCaprio. It's every slave owner or slave trader in the movie, and they're all white. They're all using it, in part to signify that they are, to signify that they're terrible people. And one of the things that, and so I take like when you said that when I read that in your piece, that was something I really thought about. But one of the biggest the reverse of the racial ventriloquism thing is that one of the biggest sort of objections, one of the most that I remember in sort of political journalism world was when Matt Drudge pasted Quentin Tarantino's face on the cover of the Drudge Report, and was like, and then he put an asterisk in the middle of the word, and it was like, oh, I'm not really saying it.
Right.
I'm just, and it's in quotes, so I'm not really saying it. And like that to me felt like such naked racial ventriloquism. And also it was like he was objecting to the use of the word not because he finds it really deeply offensive, but because the movie portrays white people as racist. In the context of the film, they certainly, like, the characters are racist, like, there's no question, and slavery was a racist institution. And he's, like, objecting to that, right? He's objecting to, like, there's this, like, modern context in which, it's almost like some white people react to the idea that white people can be racist as racism itself.
Right.
And like
right.
that, and I felt like that particular objection came through in a lot of film reviews I read, where people were like, well, my ears are too delicate to hear this terrible, terrible word, when it's really like, you're really just pissed that, there's no, like, the movie is inverted, so instead of white people being the heroes and the villains and everything else, they're portrayed in this negative light, as opposed to the way that brown people are treated as disposable in every other Western that's almost every other Western that's ever existed.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's valid. And I think if we were dealing with another filmmaker, someone other than Quentin Tarantino, I would probably be more inclined to see it that way. But I think he has a certain kind of pre-existing fixation with it, and so. This is a context in which it is appropriate, historically, but artistically, about the first half of the movie, I was right on board. But in the second half, it just really started to seem like the ratio of N-words per scene just went to a place that I couldn't really feel comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things you mentioned earlier when you were discussing sort of the inversion that Tarantino uses in the film. So I took a lot of film classes in college, and I had to watch a lot of like John Ford Westerns and stuff like this. And so like I found particularly the sort of second half, and if you haven't seen Django, I'm going to warn you right now, spoilers are coming.
Right.
The second half of the film, where he basically, the only white person who survives meeting Django in Mississippi is Franco Neri, who's the Italian actor who played Django in the original Italian spaghetti western that inspired Tarantino to do this film. And it's just like, this is the first time I think I've ever seen a like big budget Hollywood film that treats white antagonists that aren't like Nazis or something, or like foreigners in some way, the way that American Indians, Latinos and Black people have been treated, in almost every in for like 100 years of making movies. I mean, if like you go back and like arguably the first like American action movie is Birth of a Nation, right?
Right.
And you have this like incredible, it's just like this incredibly racist propaganda film that is like, also incredibly influential as like a piece of work. But like it begins with this like whitewashing of history and this rationalization of slavery, and you take this Western hero who is in the genre there is no more iconic American protagonist than the Western hero, who represents rugged individualism and everything else. But and you make him. It's just like I found that inversion so satisfying, having seen so many films where the opposite is true. And I think after I read your piece, I felt a little less. I enjoyed the movie less than I did while I was watching it, in part because I think you identified a lot of things that are pretty problematic with it. But that in particular, like, I think Django doesn't really work as like a sort of historical film, right? But I think it works great as a kind of fuck you to John Ford and D.W. Griffith and Gary Cooper and John Wayne. And if I keep it in that box, I feel much better about it.
Right. I think there's a transaction, at play here. Like there were things in Django that people found to be really empowering and satisfying, both as entertainment and as the kind of catharsis that we're getting from this person recognizing the really backward history of Black people in cinema, the way Black people have been shown in cinema, and attempting to turn it on its head. My criticism is one, how well that's done, and two, some of the fallout that comes, within it. And so, in terms of talking about the Western, one of the big defenses of this movie has been it's not a historical movie. It's not. And then some people said it's set in slavery. It's not about slavery. And I've had a hard time making that distinction. Because when we look at the Westerns were not necessarily overtly about Western history, the history of the West. But they certainly reflected what we thought popularly about the West, and in turn shaped the way future generations understood the West. And so, because it's not specifically claiming to be a movie about history, like Lincoln, for instance, where we can critique it on those very overt standards, it becomes even more effective in some ways in conveying what we might think about history. And so if this is a plausible scenario, if we're willing to suspend disbelief and engage with these characters, what else do we take away from this story? Because I remember, I think it was the Native American writer Sherman Alexie, when he was talking about realizing how sick it was that he watched cowboy movies as a young person and cheered for the cowboy, not the Indian. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really simply saying that Westerns didn't purport to be historical, but they certainly were connected to history, and they in turn shaped how we understood history, and that's important. We have to think about that. And so he called, I think they call this a Southern, not a Western, because he takes those Western motifs and places them on a plantation. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying the same rule applies.
So this is, but this sort of brings up, right, so like the Western, I mean, like, I'm not going to mince words about this, like, the Western is like this incredible propaganda vehicle for white supremacy, not even starting with Birth of a Nation, but Birth of a Nation in particular, but particularly against, as you mentioned, Sherman Alexie, watching, being a young Indian kid and watching cowboys and Indians and rooting for the cow. I mean, like, that's so, I mean, like, that's, I mean, you're absolutely right that it shaped, that this shapes our understanding of history. Fiction shapes our understanding of history in a way that is like incredibly influential when, when it comes time to understand ourselves. In particular, like, and this is true even of Tarantino, right? Because there's a big, the plot of the film is, there's a big section of the plot of the film that is, involves this sort of these fictional Mandingo fights.
Right.
Quote unquote, which is like not a real thing that happened. Mm-hmm. Like I'm sure slaves were forced to fight each other every once in a while, but it wasn't like there wasn't like a slave fighting circuit that would have like made their plan an effective cover. Mm-hmm. And he thinks those are real. I mean, like when he was asked about it, he was like, "Oh no, those are real." And I didn't know about them until I saw the 1975 film Mandingo, which is not. He's doing what you said, which is that he's setting a film as history that is not actually historical in order to like make his film, which he's saying is not a history, but is like thinks this one thing in it is historical when it's not. But in terms of like, in particular, shaping history in the Western, I mean, like part of what is so great about, or what I really enjoyed about Django is like the key figure in the Western, this rugged Western individualist, is frequently a former Confederate soldier. And this idea of like, I mean, like, and the whole like romance of the lost cause, like just runs through the entire genre to this day. I mean, if you, have you seen this show, Hell on Wheels on AMC?
I have not.
Well, so there's the main character is a former Confederate soldier who's chasing down the Union, the bastard Union soldier who killed his wife, right? So we have this entire genre of film where frequently like the people who committed treason in defense of slavery are getting back at those Union guys because they committed the real crimes. In this show, they like like the main character who's a former Confederate soldier. He's like, oh, well, I freed my slaves years before the war, and then I kept them on at wages.
Yeah, that's convenient.
And then I went to fight for the South anyway.
Well, you know,
I went to go to war to defend slavery, and it doesn't even end there. There's another character who's like an anti-slavery guy who was in Bleeding Kansas, and he talks about fighting alongside John Brown, and he's like, John Brown was a stone cold killer, and then he lectures him on how John Brown, this guy who fought for slavery, lectures this guy who fought with John Brown about what a monster he is. It's just like, this is like still with us, like very much. This whole romanticization of the South and the Lost Cause and the Confederacy wasn't really about slavery or white supremacy.
And even, I think that those things are important. I think that I mean, that's one of the smarter things about Django. And I think that it's worth pointing it out. It's not even solely the Western genre where this happens. If you remember that hokey Mel Gibson movie from some years ago, The Patriot, where he plays this reluctant revolutionary, and when people, when the British, come to his plantation and start trying to tell black people that they should fight against the colonies, against the colonists, because they'll be granted freedom. The black people say, "Oh, we're not slaves here. We're being paid." I was like, "This is in South Carolina." It's almost like you're waiting for the scene where the black person comes in from the field and says that they have substandard equipment and they're going to call their union rep. So, no, but I think that does happen, right? I think that was one of the virtues of what Tarantino was trying to do. The other side of it, though, is that I think that there are certain hazards implicit in dealing with slavery in the South. And in creating, my biggest objection in creating the character Stephen, who is the embodiment of a stereotype of the so-called house Negro, the so-called house slave, what Tarantino does is get himself into some very hot water, because that character who's reprehensible winds up being the ultimate nemesis for Django. So we understand this person goes on this quest in order to free his wife. But the biggest problem, the last person he has to kill in order to be free is not a slaveholder. It's another black person who's been enslaved. Now, I felt that was passing a certain kind of judgment on an enslaved person that I wasn't comfortable with Tarantino doing. I wasn't comfortable with a white director doing that, period, if I have to be honest with you. The reason for it is this. Because slavery produces, in any oppressive circumstance, produces people who are warped in particular ways. That's why we are opposed to oppressive circumstances. And to pass judgment on that character in a certain kind of way is something that maybe people who have shared that experience can do. But it's certainly not something that someone from outside that experience should be allowed to do, I don't think. And so in a theater, sitting in a darkened theater and seeing, a large, significant number, I watched it in Harlem, but it was a, interracial, mixed, multiracial audience there. Seeing a significant number of white people laughing at that character unsettled me deeply.
So this is like something that I felt really strongly about reading your piece. Like I think what you're saying is like absolutely correct, right? So even if we accept that the character of Stephen is realistic in some way, to say that this idea of people passing judgment of today's white people today passing judgment on the sort of unethical choices that an enslaved person makes in order to sort of carve some sort of bearable existence out of being someone else's property is like really uncomfortable, right? I totally agree with you about that. I didn't. At where I saw the movie theater, I didn't, I didn't hear any white people laughing at Stephen, but
that might have just been my crowd, the crowd that I was with that night.
I mean, I don't know, but like certainly your description of that made me angry when I was thinking about it. So I think Tarantino and Jackson tried to make Stephen more complicated than simply like a live action Uncle Ruckus, right? I think they were trying to do something more than that there. I wonder how much people are laughing because, people might find the character of Stephen funny because it's a like to Sam Jackson as the house Negro is like an act of great cinematic irony, right? Because he is, I think he put in, I saw an interview with him where he talked about, he's like, 15 years ago, I could have played Django. Now you want me to play the most hated Negro in cinematic history. And like, that's, I think that's part of what Tarantino thought was funny about casting Jackson as Steven was you have never seen Jackson like this. Like he is usually the Django-like character who is killing everybody. And I think that actually raises another issue that I have with Tarantino, which we can get to later, about sort of his perception and portrayal of black masculinity is very one-dimensional. So I think Sam Jackson, when he's talking about Steven, he describes him as the Dick Cheney of the plantation, right? I mean, in his mind, he's not. This isn't. He like when we first see Steven, he's got this like, this fake old timey slave accent that would come out of like a 1950s movie or whatever. He's got a limp. He's very much, he's trying to fit the classic Uncle Tom stereotype. And then throughout the course of the film, we learn the accent's fake, the limp is fake. He like later, in one scene in particular, he actually summons Leonardo DiCaprio into the library. And when DiCaprio's character gets there, he's like sitting there sifting, a glass of brandy or something. And I think like there is an attempt at irony there, whereas like not only is it, he really hates Django and he's exploiting this racist system for his own benefit, and he's evil for that. But he's not just a servant; he is, in some sense, the master. And I think like that raises other problematic questions, obviously, but I don't think it's actually that clear that he is the Dick Cheney of the plantation from the film. Like it's not clear to me that Steven is as much in charge as Steven thinks he is. Right. Which I think makes laughing at him even more problematic, because if it's funny because he's actually in charge, that raises a whole other set of questions which you talked about. Or I think that may have been like just us personally talking about it. But if he's not in charge, then he's actually pathetic instead of scary.
Right. I think one of the things is like those lines are very complicated, and we don't have a lot of practice about thinking about race in complicated ways in this country. We tend to avoid the complications that are implicit in it. And so there was one moment that I thought I just did not have faith that the ironies implicit in it were going to be understood, and the subtleties and nuances of it were going to be understood. And that is when Leonardo DiCaprio's character Calvin Candy tells Steven that Django will be staying in the house with them. And, Steven has a fit and says that they have to burn the mattresses, burn the linen, burn everything that he comes in contact with. Which was a point that the audience roared at. And I was saying that I just couldn't find, that kind of self-contempt, that kind of self-hatred, which would be the logical outcome of a slave system. I couldn't find that to be funny. I certainly,
because he's not faking that.
Excuse me?
Like unlike the limp and the the limp and the accent.
Right, he really does mean that. Right. And so,
yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, so when that moment happens and the audience laughs, I mean, there's a certain kind of nervous laughter or uncomfortable laughter that people have. But what I got, and at least in the theater where I saw it, was kind of genuine belly laughs, like, this is hilarious. And I said, no, that kind of self-contempt is something that was supposed to be the hallmark of the degradation of slavery. And that's not something we can...
It's not funny.
Right, it's not funny.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think you really, I think I agree with you entirely when it comes to that. I mean, I do think that they were trying to make him more than that, right? So like, he's supposed to be more than simply the sellout stereotype. And like, I think I think for reasons you've described, he's not it's not entirely successful, right? I mean, I think, and maybe because I like the film, when I first saw it, I was sort of ignoring that, but like what I thought they were trying to say was that, so you remember, have you seen Gone with the Wind?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you remember, so like at the, the house gets burned down and the slaves are just like, we're going to stick around.
Mm-hmm.
And like Steven's like sort of, Steven is like he's not that character exactly. He's in it for himself. It's not like I never, at least I don't think, I thought the impression that I was supposed to get from the film was not that he loves candy, but that he needs candy to get what he wants.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But like the sheets joke, right? Like, and I think you've identified like the joke about the sheets is really problematic, right? Because that's a point at which the line gets crossed. Because he's not faking anything, he's not manipulating anybody.
Right.
It sounds like something he really truly believes, which is like almost out of character, right? Because it's clear that Steven does not think of himself as an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
He's so smart that he has to lecture his master on what the fuck is actually going on.
And if Steven is so smart, right, then why exactly does he hate Django? I mean, it raises these other kind of questions. Like, if this character, once Calvin Candy is dead, and once the sister, Candy's sister, has been dispensed with, you do have this question where you're going, well, what's the conflict between the two of them now? Unless it's just the kind of old imagined fidelity of the slave to his his overseer, to his slave master rather. And I think one of the other dynamics that made that character less tolerable was the fact that one of my other criticisms is that very few people actually show initiative in terms of having, any other resistance to the slave institution besides Django. And so, there is, one person runs away and, gets eaten by dogs. And then we see Hildy run away, and she's, subjected to, punishment in the hot box. But most people don't really seem as if they represent a threat to the slave house, to the slave plantation, or anything. And that was one of the things I thought echoed, probably unintentionally, the popular mythology around slavery. So that's when I said that Tarantino wasn't really riffing on history in this movie. He was riffing on a particular mythology that we've mistaken for history. And so we were looking around. There was a good deal of paranoia, or a good deal of at least concern among slave masters that there would be people rising up to harm them. And we look at the laws where, in South Carolina, not more than 2 black people were allowed to be in each other's company because they felt that if there were 3 or more people, then they might represent some kind of threat. And there are slave patrols where throughout the South, where people have to go devote a particular amount of time to tracking down runaways or being on the call in case there's a slave revolt. And, you don't do those kinds of things if people are really docile in the face of slavery. And so for Tarantino, he really makes his character pop, so to speak. He stands out. His hero stands out from the men of his time, which is what you always want a dramatic hero to do, to be unsuited for the evil that other people have grown accustomed to. That's the classic definition of the hero. Except in this instance, we're asked to accept the implicit idea that other people had actually grown accustomed to that evil.
Yeah, I mean, like, so I think there's one. I think you're broadly right that there isn't enough. There aren't enough examples of people actually chafing against their bonds in this film. I think at the beginning you missed one. In the beginning, there is like. There's a scene. I mean, like it's like there's a scene. I sort of feel like I should feel bad for smiling when I think of this scene, but I don't. It's the scene in the beginning when he sort of leaves the slaver trapped under his horse and he frees the slaves and they start walking towards him and he's like, "Oh, come on! Remember when I gave you my last apple?"
Right.
And it's just like that, you know. And they're just and they kill the shit out of him and break north, and like that's but like you know, and sort of you know, and on the one hand, it's like that's facilitated by the inverted magic Negro character who's played by Christopher Waltz, who does a great job.
And as he does in everything he's in, right?
Right. But you're right that there's no like there is, you know, and one of the big questions I actually had about this was about, so we have Steven, and so Steven, we're like treated, you know, at least to the partial inversion of the stereotype with Steven, because, you know, he has like a great amount of influence over his master, and in private, he's faking his whole shtick, and in private, he drinks his master's brandy without permission, and like, but so one of the big like glaring flaws in the movie, I thought, was sort of is the fact that there just are, you know, it is completely unconcerned with gender. Deliberately unconcerned with gender. So you have Brumhilde, who is, you know, she runs away and she speaks a lot and she speaks German, and you know that's pretty much everything we know about her. But the character who I was like, I kept waiting to like do something or say something was Sheba, who is the like sexy slave concubine,
right.
Candy's like sexy slave concubine, and I'm like. She keeps doing things. She's like there throughout the film, and she keeps doing things that, you know, she's sort of like, oh, I'm very happy to be the slave concubine, but we're never like, I sort of kept waiting for her to be like, no, but actually I'm gonna like help Django kill somebody.
And you know, the original
script, like it's like they portray her as like completely happy in her existence as like a privileged, pampered, you know, piece of sexual property, in a way that's just like. In the otherwise uncompromisingly brutal portrayal of slavery in the film, you have this woman who seems perfectly happy to be a slave.
There was, as I understand it, in the original script, there was more in that character. There were more scenes involving the relationships, if you can call them that, between these white men who were slavers and slaveholders, and the black women who were in this kind of concubinage situation, and you know those scenes didn't actually make it into the movie, which is an interesting choice in its own right. But one of the things that I thought when people ask, "What do you think about Kerry Washington's character Brumhilde?" is really you can't really think about that character because she was more or less a prop. Like you understood, that she was very important to the protagonist. That he had to procure her freedom. He had to free her, and that gives the mission. But what exactly was the bond between the two of them, you didn't really know. And that's why I thought it failed as a love story. Some people said that it was a love story. I thought, at the very least, in a love story, you have to understand why two people are drawn to each other. And you really don't. You really don't get that here.
Right. Like, I think they're both really good actors. But there's no... We get no backstory as to, like, how they even fall in love.
Right.
Or why they fall in love.
Right.
We just know that they're in love and they tried to escape and then they were separated.
Right.
And Django will do anything to get her back. So, I mean, as far as... So I came into this film with low expectations. I'm not a huge Tarantino fan. And I think this is my favorite Tarantino movie, having seen, like, I like it a lot more than Inglorious Basterds. And one of the reasons I like it more is that I thought... this is another thing that I thought sort of the reviews of the film do a lack of justice to, is the way violence is handled in the film is differently from every other Quentin Tarantino film that I've seen, which is that violence in Tarantino films is generally spectacle. Whereas in this film, it's spectacle only when it's being directed at slave traders, slave owners, and slave overseers. It is completely uncompromisingly horrifying when we're discussing violence directed at slaves. That's even cool. When say like even during the fight scene, that like fight scene in the parlor is horrible to watch.
Right.
Like it's not a cool. It's like there's nothing. It's not the cool stylized violence that we see. In the shootout in the plantation home later in the movie, or even in like most other Quentin Tarantino movies, he breaks, in the movie is like highly stylized, and then it breaks to have this like, and obviously this portrayal of violence is stylized, but it's stylized in a completely different way, which is that this is really fucking ugly and nasty and cruel and terrible, and that I think is like probably. I think that's more than Tarantino has done with violence in like most of his movies. Like, he's thought about how he was going to deal with violence in a way beyond, superficial. Is this going to look awesome or not? In a way that I don't think he did in previous movies.
Yeah, I think. But ironically, I came to this from a different position than you, which is that I was a big Tarantino fan before this, and I said on Twitter that. Up until last week, my ringtone for my phone was the theme song from Kill Bill, and I get the whole idea of riffing on references, on previous references, and almost doing the kind of way that jazz musicians will like riff, or the way that hip hop artists will sample and so on, and he's doing that in some really interesting ways in a lot of his films. But I think that with this film. There were too many kind of unreconciled, questions and too many unreconciled themes for me to really sign on to it. I think that's more or less. If I had to say, I thought *Inglorious Basterds* was a better film, just in terms of the idea of revenge of the, the downtrodden or the exploited.
So here's my pitch for. I felt the opposite way about *Inglorious Basterds* because *Inglorious Basterds* does something where it takes the sort of traditional war movie where there's like a bunch of scrappy guys who have to complete like some sort of suicide mission, and it turns them into Jews, right? But like the movie is like this is a Tarantino film that it changes history, right? So it ends with. In some ways, I think *Inglorious Basterds*, certainly in its treatment of gender, it's a much more interesting movie. It alters history in a way that is like feudal. Whereas like the reason why I prefer Django to *Inglorious Basterds*, where it doesn't try to alter history in that same way. It doesn't say something that happened, something that didn't happen happened, or something that happened didn't happen that didn't happen. It says. It has this one message, which I think is like people will get walking away from the film, which is that white supremacy is dumb, sad, and horrible, and it's like still in some sense still with us, and like in film in particular, whereas like. *Inglorious Basterds*, that doesn't feel as feudal to me, right? Like if Quentin Tarantino if what his goal is with Django is to make us think about film, and the way that and like who like American heroes have been, and how we've come to the conclusion, how we've decided to create our heroes and what we think of them and how we portrayed them, and particularly what they've done. If that. Like that doesn't seem feudal to me. Like you can't go back in time and prevent the Holocaust from happening and stop Hitler, or like make him be killed by a bunch of like crazy superhero guerrilla Jews. But you can like in some sense like you can like we can be a little less dumb and cruel about how we think about how our movies affect how we think. And I think that remains true even if, as you pointed out, like there's a lot of things wrong with the movie.
Yeah, I think one of the things I talked about in the piece too, that kind of first alerted me to the levels on which the history plays in Tarantino's film, and the way that audiences interact with it, is the fact that I saw *Inglorious Basterds* right before I went to teach in Moscow. And, when I was there, people really, the Russians who I talked to, really had issues with the film. And it wasn't, anything about the revenge element of it, or, cinematic elements of it, but it was really the retelling of the way that Hitler died. And, because Russians feel like, they lost 26 million or so people during the war.
Yeah.
And they feel like they've never really been recognized for the scale, the just incredible, monumental scale of the losses that were required in order to defeat.
Right, because the Cold War, the necessities, the sort of propaganda
Right.
necessities of the Cold War
Right.
made it so that, you could not say that Stalin, absorbed the brunt of the Nazi war machine, and that's why that's part of the reason that we won World War II.
Right, and in in the Red Army Museum, there's a photograph. It's a huge photograph, and it affected me deeply. And it is from World War II, and it is 1943 or so, and it's a picture of elderly women digging trenches outside of Moscow. And they were digging trenches to keep the Nazis out of the capital. And so it was kind of breathtaking because it spoke to the fact that they had mobilized everyone in their society to try to stop what was an existential threat to their existence. And to see that as a narrative, to see Inglorious Basterds as a narrative in which Hitler is killed by Americans, regardless of whatever the background of the Americans are. If they, had been a group of Black American soldiers, if they'd been a group of Jewish American soldiers, if they'd been, WASP American soldiers, the fact of the matter was that they were American soldiers. And so the movie never went any further than that. And they felt that because the history, the actual history had not been reconciled, it had not been actually properly grappled with, that any kind of alternate history, any kind of spin on that would just double down on the problems. And I think that somehow the fantasies that we're willing to accept, the things that we're willing to suspend disbelief for, sometimes say as much about our perception of history as the actual history does itself.
So my question to you is this: do you think? I don't know. Did you read the interview with Vibe that Kerry Washington, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Jamie Foxx did?
I did not. No.
So this is this interview blew my mind a little bit because Kerry Washington is talking about how she's like looking at the concept art for the film, and she sees the drawings of the metal masks that they used to put on slaves, and she says, that's some sick shit that like Quentin came up with or whatever. And then she realizes that no, those are real.
Yeah, those are real.
And I like this sort of blew my mind, but it made me wonder, right? So you're right that there's like a number of flaws in the movie. Historically, this like huge plot point is complete bullshit. It doesn't show the kind of level of resistance that was really occurring or that necessitated the sort of strict like the sort of very careful surveillance and monitoring of the slaves themselves. But do you think that in some sense, if you're someone who didn't think that the slaves resisted at all, and you saw this film, or you were sort of uneducated about how terrible slavery really was, and I think the two images of slavery that I think will stick with people for this film because they're repeated so often are the masks and the whiplashes, which are like you can see photographs of those anywhere. Do you think that someone who is ignorant both about the resistance of slaves and about how horrible slavery was might walk into this movie thinking, were there actual Djangos? Am I gonna go and try to learn something about it, or like, well, if their perception of slavery was like that it was relatively benign, that they will be completely disabused of it? And I'd say that I think my optimistic take is I think that's possible, but obviously I want to know what you think.
I mean, it's possible. I think it's possible, but it becomes like a question of like degrees, because it's like, is it as likely that people are going to take away the idea that someone like Django, as he's presented in the movie, is like 1 in 10,000, and Candy says that about him, kind of sarcastically, and then later in the movie he repeats it. Rather, Django repeats it. But I think that may be could just as well be the image, the idea that people carry away from them. It's hard to know.
Hmm.
It's really hard to know. I guess the upside I would say is that people are having conversations about slavery, and as
Right.
someone who teaches history, I'm always glad that people are willing to even have any kind of conversation about slavery. So I suppose my biggest concession would be that it's a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, and so the sad part, right, is like I think there are only starting points, right? I mean, like
Hmm.
every once in a while, a movie comes along and its portrayal of slavery is provocative enough that people start talking about slavery, and then we sort of get back to mythologies.
Right. Right,
Um,
and I will say
it,
I will say that a couple of my friends who teach slavery in their courses, teach about slavery in their courses, have been very concerned that because of the kind of culture we live in, people do absorb their messages from media or from
Mhm.
film, and we can say that this is not a movie about history, it's not a historically based movie, but that doesn't prevent people from walking out and still saying, oh, this is kind of how it was. And so
Mhm.
we were debating whether we would be unteaching this course, unteaching what people saw in this movie for the next 5 years or 10 years or however long.
Well, I think that's actually a great place to end. Jelani, thank you so much for coming on Blogging Heads. It's a
Thank you.
pleasure as always.
Hmm.
And thanks for taking the time to talk about Django Unchained.
Thanks.
All right, take care.
All right, take care.